The Great Replacement is the crime against humanity of the 21st century.
They are evidently inspiring people in ways that are producing quite frightening results.
This is pure, simple and total defamation. I am totally non-violent.
I don't accept that it is colonization.
Very great civilizations are being now destroyed by mass migration.
Hello and welcome back to UnHerd. What is the correct way to respond to hateful or divisive or downright dangerous opinions? Is it to try to ban them and hope that they just go away? Or to allow them out in the open and do your best to challenge them on the substance? Well, in the past week, the British government has definitely chosen the former option. Mr. Renaud Camus, a French novelist and writer known in earlier decades for his semi-autobiographical gay fiction, has more recently become something of a pin-up of segments of the online very right wing for his so-called Great Replacement theory, which claims that white people are being deliberately replaced by foreigners as part of a big concerted plan. He was due to speak at a conference in England on so-called remigration. We'll get into what that means shortly, but was barred from entering the UK by the Home Office, who deemed his presence, and I quote, not conducive to the public good. Well, at UnHerd, we believe that it is better to try to interrogate controversial ideas, even those that spark unease, and that is why we decided to speak with him today. I'll ask him what he means, we'll see how well his ideas stand up, and as ever, you can draw your own conclusions. If you're watching on YouTube, you can enable subtitles using the captions button near the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, as his French accent is occasionally hard to make out. Welcome to UnHerd, Mr. Camus.
Thank you very much.
So what was your reaction to the decision by the British government to ban you from entry?
Should I say amused? Because, of course, in France, Britain has a reputation as the place par excellence of the freedom of speech. And it was a strange thing to be refused entry to the country. But
do you understand why they made that decision?
They didn't really give any reason. But of course, I'm very, very much opposed to the government of that country, as I am opposed to the government of my country. So, after all, it's not that surprising that they treat me as an enemy. I'm certainly not one of their friends.
You were planning to attend this conference on the theme of remigration. And you were going to what? You were going to give a speech?
Yes.
And what were you planning to say?
It was a conference organized by the Homeland Party about remigration, and I'm of course, very, very much favorable to remigration.
So this conference is organised, as you say, by the Homeland Party. So that's a party considerably to the right of reform or those kinds of parties. We're usually very hesitant about using the term far right, but I think in this case, it is a fair description. They were a branch of something called Patriotic Alternative, which itself is basically a neo-Nazi party.
No, that I'm certainly not a neo-Nazi or a Nazi. Also, Great Replacement is, of course, a Nazi or was a Nazi practice.
Homeland, for example, organised its launch party on Adolf Hitler's birthday. Is that just a coincidence, do we think?
I don't know much about them. They invited me because I had approved on X some things they say about remigration. I think I'm very much favorable to remigration, but I'm very surprised about what you tell me about the Hitler birthday party.
So let's talk about remigration, since that's what you were going to talk about. What exactly do you want to see? What do you want to happen?
What I want is decolonization. I'm a coherent anti-colonialist. I think Britain and France and Europe in general is much more colonialist.
And what do you mean exactly? Who is colonizing Europe?
The rest of the world. Colonization is mostly about transfer of population. and the transfer of population now south-north is considerably more important than the transfer of population north-south during the first colonization. I think the new colonization is much more of the essence of what colonization is, which is transfer of population, than the precedent colonization. For instance, French colonization, French colonial empire was very much an empire, of course, but rather little colonization, except in Canada in the 18th century and in Algeria in the 19th century, there were very little transfer of population. There are very little French population in, for instance, in Black Africa. It was more like a conquest or an empire, which I certainly do not approve of, but the colonization properly, colonization in European tradition since the antiquity is mostly transfer of population, like what happened when the Phoenicians and the Greek decided transferring part of the population to North Africa and Sicily, Great Greece, or the southern Italy. But France, for instance, had far less people in Black Africa, but there are Black Africans in France now. So we are much more colonized than we ever colonized ourselves.
So you used the word colonized to describe mass immigration, basically. That's your description. What does remigration mean?
I think decolonization and remigration are more or less synonymous, say about the same thing. Like no occupation can end without the departure of the occupier, and no colonization can end without the departure of the colonizator or the colonist. Colonization of France or Britain can indeed finish only by the departure of the colonizer.
So this is about mass emigration or removal by force, I suppose, of recently...
Not necessarily by force. Decolonization have happened in many countries without violence. For instance, in Black Africa, again, the decolonization went on a very pacific way, or the decolonization of India was very pacific. The English withdrew. There was a war afterwards, a civil war inside what had been the Indian Empire, but that had nothing to do with decolonization. So very often decolonization doesn't imply violence.
So what is it that you would like to see happen in a country like the United Kingdom or France? You would then identify people who are of foreign heritage. Are we talking about newly arrived immigrants, or are you talking about second generation? Where would you draw the line? Because this is where policies like that really start to get interesting and much more worrying to people.
To the contrary, like in every colonization, was very clear, for instance, in French Algeria, when French Algeria became independent in 1962, the Algerian considered, and all the words considered with them, so there are no trouble or no disapprobation at all from the United States or from the other country. Quite to the contrary, they were very much approved by great powers of the time, including the United States and, of course, Russia, the USSR. They considered that the French people, who had been there for 5, 6, or 7 generations, a very long time, had to go. And so had to go also the Jewish population, which is very unfair because the Jewish population had been there for even longer than the Arabs, which are themselves a colonial power. And they consider that the French colons had to leave. And they forced them to leave in a very violent manner, which is never mentioned, because there was even massacre of people who were not living fast enough, the kind of massacre which is never mentioned because it is not in the massacre fashion.
So you mentioned 6 or 7 generations. Are you seriously suggesting that people who are multiple generations inside the United Kingdom, 6 or 7 generations, would then be removed or would choose to leave?
Very few which have been there for so long. Colonization in the United Kingdom is much, much shorter than colonization in French Algeria. So people who have been there for 6 or 7 generations are, I think, very few and far between.
Well, let's say 2 or 3 generations. You would include those people in your remigration plan?
Yes, like in all decolonization before that. No colonization has ever ended without the colonizer leaving, of course.
So your definition of this is actually more extreme than a lot of these groups that themselves are considered on the far right, because most of them will publicly at least say that they are only talking about either first generation arrivals who might then be encouraged to go home to their country of origin through financial incentives. That's the kind of soft version of remigration. But what you're talking about really seems to be a kind of excision of all families that have immigrant heritage. Is that how you see it? I mean, it seems such a kind of wild idea, and so would be very, very terrifying and upsetting to, I would suspect, the vast majority of people inside the UK. But have I understood you correctly?
I don't see what's so terrifying about it. It's what has happened in all decolonization. I am very much against colonization, all colonization. So I think no colonization can end without the departure of the colonists. But of course, I do not approve at all the very violent way which decolonization has been practiced, notably in Algeria, which is the most patent example of remigration. But there is other way of having the colony leave.
So how are you going to identify which people would be remigrated? Is it only people who are from different races, or if they are partially, what you would refer to as indigenous British and partially from an immigrant background, would they also be on your boats leaving the country? How are you going to define who is now an immigrant and who is not?
Mostly what they decide, they behave like people totally integrated. They not necessarily have to leave, but most of the actual colonial occupiers are very much attached to their own culture and civilization. And that is what makes of them colons or colonialists. They have their religion, they have their, very often, more and more often, they have their language. I don't know what is the situation in England on that respect, but in France, the actual colons speak more and more their own language, and why would they not? Most of the time, it's a very important language which has its own culture, its own poetry, its own literature, and which is a very important and cultural language. And they are so glamorous now that one wonders why they should speak French. And they do wonder that themselves, since they do not even speak French. They have their own religion, they have their own religious buildings, they are acting entirely as colonialists. When the French were in Algeria, they constructed churches and monuments of French culture, and they are acting like colons, and so are the actual colons. They have no consideration whatsoever for French culture.
So your test, I'm trying to work out in the practical world what your test would be. Your test is not only do you speak English or French in France, would you be permitted to have a second language that you might use in a domestic setting, or would you not even allow that? I'm trying to work out how you would test who you would want to remigrate.
I really don't understand your question. I mean, this is so obvious. I don't see why you don't understand that.
It's not obvious at all, Mr. Camus, because you have in this country many millions of people who have combined.
Indian English Empire. Did you have any doubt of who was colonized and who was a colon? That's very simple. That is obvious. English were colons and the Indians were colonized. That's very simple. I don't understand why there's any difficulty in understanding that.
It's an ethnic test then, is it? So if you are fully Indian, you are not English. Is that how you think of it?
Very importantly, an ethnic and even a matter of race. Of course, that crime, the crime of great replacement, of replacement in general, has been permitted by the absurd dogma of the inexistence of races. Indeed, if there are no races, there is no great replacement, because if you oppose to the colonization of your own country, you are immediately called a racist, and no one wants to be called a racist. So it's a perfect crime. You can't even oppose the disparition or the replacement of your own people.
Well, now we're getting somewhere, because at least I understand what you mean. It is a racial test. You basically would like to identify people of insufficiently indigenous races, by your terms, or people who are too much Indian or too much African. Presumably, would there be a percentage? I mean, if you have one of your 4 grandparents is white English and 4 of them are African, would you also be on one of your boats, or would you then be accepted as a indigenous English? I mean, how would you define that?
I suppose in India, when India became independent, there were a few English people who stayed there because they considered themselves to be Indian and not English or British or Scottish or whatever anymore. And even in Algeria, there were a few French people who tried to stay there. They were not very lucky and very fortunate because they were hated by the Algerian, and most of them had to leave rather quickly. But some consider they were more Algerian than French, and they stayed in Algeria. And in some decolonization, some of the colonizators, which were very much integrated into the colonized country, decided to stay at decolonization. That might happen.
It's obviously very different to India or Algeria, because we have very large numbers of people with foreign heritage who have been living here for some time. In the case of this country, for example, there was a large wave of West Indian immigrants in the 50s and the 60s. They are now maybe 2, maybe 3, possibly now into the 4th generation. I'm sure that the overwhelming majority of them would consider themselves British. So would that group, for example, just not be relevant to your remigration plans? They get a tick by Monsieur Camus because they self-describe as English. Is that right?
Well, what you are saying is exactly what I am saying. You are saying that there are much more than there were in North-South colonization. You are saying that the colonists are more numerous now, so this would give them more reason to say no. It just proves that it's more of a colonization, but the colonization's the other way, which it is actually. You are quite right.
I'm trying to understand how you would decide who should be remigrated. You've mentioned race, but then you've said if people consider themselves part of the adopted country, even if they're multiple generations, you would accept that they could stay. So now I'm not sure that race is the defining factor. Is it simply a test that if they feel British, you don't want them to leave?
People can always integrate individuals by love, by culture, by habit, by the long stay. You can always integrate individuals. You no people can integrate other people if it is a people, which is very much the case of the population in the colonial actual population in countries like France or Britain or Germany, for instance. They are people, they stay a people, and so they are a colonial people. And if decolonization happens, which is the right of the colonized people, everybody has always considered that the colonized people had a right to its independence, so the colonial people have to leave.
Yeah, I still got to say, I don't feel you've answered me on this point, but I'm going to try one more time, Monsieur Camus. Let's take a specific example. If there is someone of Bangladeshi heritage, let's say, whose parents arrived here in the United Kingdom 20 years ago, has gone through the British school system, considers themselves fully British, has a British passport, was born here, but is brown-skinned and has parents who were born in Bangladesh, but who considers themselves British and is looking forward to living their life in Britain, what would you say to that person? Are they not allowed to remain?
Probably not. They are colonialists. They are occupiers. They have to leave. Algerian consider that the French people who had been there much longer than your Bangladeshi of two generations had to leave, and they actually had to leave. And they were forced to leave in a very violent way, which I certainly do not approve. And I think decolonization can happen in much more civilized and pacific manner.
But how are you going to avoid violence when people don't want to leave and there are millions of them?
One way of having people leave is, of course, making it unworth their while to stay there. For example.
But in the example we just talked about, which is useful because it's concrete, this 20-year-old person born in the United Kingdom who has just left and been through the whole school system here, what possible way would you have to encourage or discourage them to leave the country they've always lived in and move somewhere else? How would you make it unattractive for them to stay? Would you have a kind of dual system of laws, one for people who were deemed by your test to be part of the colonizer community and a different from the indigenous community? You end up in a kind of apartheid kind of situation. Tell me how you would do that in practice.
Would be enough to reverse the actual system, which is certainly a dual system, quite officially in Britain, with now the colossal two-tier system in justice, which is so evident in Britain as it is in France, where for the same crimes, the natives are much more condemned than the colons, would have simply to be reversed. The colonial law will have to be abolished, and the colonial law is imposed by the power who want colonization and the change of people and civilization, which is, of course, an horrid crime, which is a crime par excellence of the crime against humanity of the 21st century. The change of people and civilization. The great replacement is the crime against humanity of the 21st century. Colonization is just part of it.
I want to come on to the great replacement and what that actually means. But first of all, I just want to quote some things that you've said back at you to see how you respond. And my question is whether you are surprised that people get a certain impression of you when you say things like this. So this was most recently on Twitter. Afghans will make one miss Pakis. I mean, this is in my country, the kind of perfect example of a racist slur to call someone a Paki. Why would you do that?
Because I see the word Paki all the time. It seems very common in England, but if it's
Depends what circles you're moving.
Not want to slur the Pakistanis. It sounded better that way, and you may put it on my bad use of English. Maybe it's
I see.
Improper, like some word would be in French.
Okay, let me try another one. So, Lady Yvette Cooper de Lange, my new idol. I owe her everything. May she be the matchstick of truth that will spark the decolonial indigenous revolt.
Yes.
What is the indigenous revolt that you want to see? You're insistent that you don't want to see violence, and yet when you use language like that, you can understand why people are concerned that you are actually trying to stir up violence. What kind of revolt is this?
Has been colonial revolt, which have not been at all violent. I think Gandhi should be our principal model. Gandhi has succeeded in decolonializing a considerable empire of hundreds of millions of people in a very pacific way. I think we should imitate Gandhi more than all other decolonialist champions, and certainly more than the Algerian, which were extremely violent.
I mean, the reality is, though, Mr. Camus, that your ideas have not been taken up by Gandhi-like figures who are doing marches and tax protests. They've been used by people who take much more violent action. We know, for example, that the perpetrators of the 2019 Christchurch shootings, the 2019 El Paso shooting, the 2022 Buffalo shooting, and the 2023 Jacksonville shooting all made reference to Great Replacement theory. So there you have 4 concrete examples of very violent, murderous actions that have been inspired by your ideas. So do you take responsibility for that?
This is pure, simple, and total defamation, and has been established as pure and simple defamation by several courts in New Zealand and in France. The expression Great Replacement is now, has been for years, all over the world, and has been used by all sorts of people. But the killer of Christchurch, to which you were alluding, has never made any reference to me. Never. That has been established by the New Zealand court, which has been an inquest of his inspiration. He wrote a brochure called The Great Replacement, which has absolutely no relation to my book, The Grand Remplacement in French, which at that time had not even been translated into English. It has been translated into English very recently. He didn't know at all my name, and certainly not a reference to this killer. All the other killer who mentioned the Great Replacement were in reference to his brochure called The Great Replacement, and certainly not to me. At the center of my thinking is a notion a bit difficult to explain, I admit, especially in English. It's not very easy to explain in French. Is what I call innocence. That is non-nonsense, non-nuisance, non-violence, be it to the earth, to the trees, to the water, to your neighbor, and certainly to people. If the killer in New Zealand had been inspired by me and had read my books and would do what I say, he certainly would not have killed hundreds of people, 100 people in a mosque, which is exactly contrary to what I want and recommend. I am totally non-violent. I'm not a pacifist because I think pacifists has always led to the worst situation, but I am non-violent.
The trouble is that you are offering yourself as a public intellectual. You need to take responsibility for your ideas, and they are all over the internet, and they are evidently inspiring people, even if it's not directly in the way that you have asked for, in ways that are producing quite frightening results. At what stage do you need to kind of take responsibility for that? It seems a reasonable ask.
I take responsibility for what I have written. People who obviously have never read any line by me, who do not even know my name, like the killer in New Zealand, how could I have the slightest responsibility in his action, which I have disapproved hundreds of times in the most clear fashion? How could I have any responsibility for somebody who does exactly the contrary to what I recommend and to what I advocate? There's no responsibility for people who do the contrary of what you say.
What you are teaching people, though, Mr. Camus, is that there is an existential threat to them, that the crime against their culture is equivalent to genocide, and that these, what you call colonizers or immigrants, you need to revolt against, and they need to be remigrated or removed. And most people would follow that sequence of logic and not be that surprised if there were violent outcomes. So I think it's a difficult thing to put all those pieces in place and then say, but of course I'm a pacifist. I don't like violence. I love peace like Gandhi, but all these other things are true. That's a difficult position.
Are you saying that you approve colonization?
I don't accept the use of the term colonization to describe immigration. I think that's a clever idea, because what you're doing is you're using a term that is associated with the political left to give you cover, but actually it's just a verbal trick. Mass immigration in recent decades bears very little resemblance to the colonization of India in the 19th century.
Mass immigration, no, it is very contrary to decolonization in India, but it is colonization. But the word immigration, of course, is absurd. It's totally out of fashion. People who still use that old-fashioned word are accomplices to what is going on. Immigration was a historical phenomenon which has lasted from the end of the 19th century to the end of the 20th century. What is happening now in the West, and especially in Europe, has absolutely nothing to do with immigration. Immigration was something entirely different. It was something concerning individuals who could very well integrate and become members of the society they were moving into. What is going on now has absolutely nothing to do with immigration, and immigration is a very mentor word which should not be used anymore. It has not, what is going on has nothing to do with immigration. And you make me responsible for the crime committed in the name of decolonization. And of course, there has been crime committed in the name of decolonization. Decolonization has sometimes been very violent and very even criminal, with attentats and things like that in the world. That doesn't in the least deconsider the concept of decolonization. Decolonization is the moral law and has been accepted by absolutely everybody as entirely legitimate. All the countries and all the people in the world have the right to have their own territories, their own culture, their own civilization, and not have it subverted by other people coming en masse, as you yourself admit.
In terms of your reading of history, I've got a quote here from some of your writings. You say, in 15 centuries, there has not been a single episode, dramatic though some have been, neither the 100 Years' War nor the German occupation, that has represented a threat as serious, deadly, and virtually definitive in its consequences for our homeland as the change of people. What about the Normans, for example, in your own country or in the northern part of your own country? If you were a Frankish lord in the 800s, and you suddenly start seeing a lot of these Scandinavian people arriving, sometimes forcefully and sometimes just settling there and gradually taking over what became Normandy. Was that a great replacement?
Yes, but the sentence which you have been quoted and to which I stand entirely was, since it mentions 15th century, was in relation to France. In France, there has not been such a thing for 15th century. In England, the count can be different. You allude to the Normans, so let's say 10th century.
Well, the Normans arrived in France before they arrived in England, am I right? The Normans were Scandinavian people. They moved to northern France in the 900s before they came to England. Was that also great replacement? They took over, in a matter of 100 years, the whole northern part of France.
Yes, but it's absolutely nothing compared to what's going on actually in France. They were invaders. There have always been invasions, but they didn't stay there for ages. So for one thing, they decided after a while that they would be better off in England, and they went from Normandy to England, but they partly colonized indeed what was given to them as Normandy, but it didn't change the general feature of France to the extent of what massive colonization is doing now to France. That's much less important phenomenon, and I'm sticking entirely to the French, to the phrase, to the sentence you so kindly quoted.
The truth is that languages, cultures, peoples have always been moving around. They've always been evolving throughout history. And the one thing that has never happened is everybody staying the same and not moving. So that would be the exception rather than the rule. I'm struggling to see how continued migration flows are a break with millennia of tradition. Isn't it just a continuation of that tradition?
No, I'm sorry. Great movement of migration have not been the normality in the history of humanity. It's quite to the contrary. Great moment of civilization are, to the contrary, moment where a people has resisted to the flow of invasion and decided that he would be himself. In France, for instance, for 15th century, there have been absolutely no invasion, no change of population, and that has led a great civilization. And in England, for centuries, there has been no change of population. That is a myth. The great civilization in the history of the world have been people staying in the same place for as long as possible, and massive migration have, quite to the contrary, destroyed those great moments of civilization, like they are presently destroying some of the greatest civilization of the world, like the English civilization or the French civilization or the German culture. All the great civilization have been moments of stability. Without stability, there has, I think, never been great civilization. And very great civilization are being now destroyed by mass migration.
I suppose you are an academic person, you are an intellectual, a writer. You were proposing to come to a conference in England, which you're now not going to do. From our perspective, it is very hard to believe what you've just said, looking at the history of this country, because there were the Romans who came and went, then there were the Anglo-Saxons, from whom we get the word English, who came from Germany and continental Europe. We had large amounts of Viking settlers that became kings of England. We then, of course, had the Normans, who came from your own country, France, but of course, 150 years before that were from Sweden and Denmark and Scandinavia. And we've just had constant changes. And by the way, the Christian heritage which you are celebrating was largely built, those great cathedrals, by Normans. They brought the technology with them from France. Without that invasion, we would probably not have the cathedrals and the heritage that you are so anxious to defend. So I just cannot look at our own history and see it as a history of a single people staying still.
Or the great moment of English history as a moment of stability with no invasion and no change of people, which has lasted for centuries. I don't see what invasions there has been in England between the 12th, so even the 11th century and the end of the 19th century. All the great period of English history is the Elizabethan period or the Victorian period or even the 18th century have been very stable and no change of population. There has been, of course, individuals coming in and welcome, and we sometimes have had a very great and good influence on the country, but there has not been change of civilization. The migration period to which you allude and which are very real are very short period in the history of Great Britain. The Norman conquest was about took one day, that is Battle of Hastings, let's say a century, but it was a very short period, and then the population was extremely stable. The English in the 18th century didn't think they were a mixed race. They were English, and they had been English for centuries. All the great period, what makes England famous and great are period where there was no invasion and no change of population. And what is destroying England now is the mass migration.
The English in the 18th century that you refer to had a German king who couldn't even speak English.
Well, that's an individual. But
well, he's the king. Should they have remigrated George I back to Hanover because he was insufficiently acclimatized and integrated to British customs because he didn't even speak English?
George III was King of England for being partly a steward by heritage. And he was, of course, German, but he inherited that kingdom, maybe unfairly. And we're not go into that, but it was just individual, which the country did not become German because George I could not speak English or could hardly speak English.
But it shows, doesn't it, the absurdity of trying to pretend that cultures were homogeneous and that non-perfect assimilation into them was grounds to expel you from the country. I think if you look at history, this has been happening all the time. And my question to you is, when you put these ideas forth in maybe a flippant way, or you find it amusing, or maybe you don't, but there is a very dangerous side effect, is there not? Which is that people who are less educated, perhaps, than you, might hear what you're saying and think differently about what appropriate action should be. So they're told, this educated Frenchman tells me, that we are the victim of illegal colonization, that these people need to be ejected from our society. And suddenly, here we have a land of 70 million people. Between 5 and 10 or maybe 15 million of them could be described as immigrant or descendant from immigrants. You're starting something that are close to a civil war if you have a majority turning on a minority like that. It does feel dangerous. And so I ask you once again, what do you say to that?
I notice that your language is extremely aggressive, saying that I pretend this and that. I insist in the truth and the fact that the great moment of English history had corresponded to a very stable civilization. And that's the example of a German king is really a detail. And if he was king of England, he would because he was not entirely German and had an English and Scottish heritage. If there is something which has no risk of happening, it's a civil war. Civil war is, of course, coherent in your language, but of course it would not be at all a civil war. A civil war is a war between parts of a country, because in France, for instance, between Catholic and Protestant, in England, between Jacobites and partisans of the George, Hanoverians. That's civil war. You had an enormous civil war in the middle of the 17th century. That was a civil war.
If it's not a civil war, what sort of war would it be? How would you describe it if it does become violent, what you are alluding to?
It would not be at all a civil war. It would be a decolonial revolt, which doesn't have to be a war and doesn't have either to be violent. It could escape violence, but it might be a war. As I said before, I am not violent. I think great replacement and multicultural society are crimes because they bring violence and horror and crimes and rapes, daily crimes in society, which before that were very quiet and non-violent, which very little crime. I am against great replacement because I am against violence, and a decolonial revolt could be non-violent.
Let's spend a moment before I let you go on what great replacement actually is, because the way you're talking, you are clearly against mass immigration. You clearly want to find a way to reverse the mass immigration, and we've discussed how practical or not that would be. There's something else about your great replacement theory, though, isn't there, which is this idea that it is a deliberate conspiracy of some kind of cabal of people who have designed this evil outcome deliberately in order to achieve certain nefarious aims. Tell us more about that. Who are these people and what are their nefarious aims?
The great replacement is not a theory, but I have a theory which I call global replacism, which is, I think, the third totalitarianism of the 20th century, along with communism and Nazism, which it has greatly inspired. Global replacism is born with the second revolution. It's very American in origin. Its two main creators and protagonists are Frederick Winslow Taylor. We said from now on, man will not be first, system will be first, and then Henry Ford, which is kind of the prophet of the religion founded by Taylor. Both have been considerable inspiration for the two
totalitarianism.
Yes, thank you. Which are, of course, Nazis and communists. Ford was a great admiration of Hitler. He's one of the rare persons which are quoted in Mein Kampf, and Hitler has his portrait in the Chancery. And of course, Ford was extremely anti-Semitic. Also, Taylor was a great inspiration for Lenin, which had said when he was not in power that Taylorism was a monstrosity, and which, as soon as he was in power, imposed Taylorism in his system, and Stalin went in the same way. Replacism is the heir of both of a system. It's less old than communists, but older than Nazism, and is now the most efficient system in the world. And it is not conspiracy, but you might call it a machination, which is making of the world and of man a machine and a product. It is the greatest crime against humanity and also against every conception of what being is, because it makes man a spare part which can be exchanged in any moment.
Final thought, Mr. Camus. A lot of what you say is not especially controversial. What you've just been talking about is a kind of reactionary objection to capitalism that I can think of many other people who would share. And probably a lot of people would have sympathy with the idea that the mechanization has had bad effects, that capitalism in its most extreme form can have inhuman end results, that mass immigration has had worrying results, and that we need to think about how to take that forward. That's all a very reasonable conversation. And no one would be banning you from the country based on that. By the way, I don't think you should be banned from the country, whatever you say. But I just want to address this, that a lot of what you say is interesting and normal and reasonable and nothing to worry about much. Where it gets concerning to people is ideas like that you should uproot an entire section of the population based on their ethnicity and find ways to evict them from the country. And that suddenly, I think you would understand, is quite concerning to people. So I put it to you that those more difficult ideas are transgressing the very rule that you've just given us because they seem inhuman. It seems more like the replacists that you were talking about, the idea that you can just define millions of people by some kind of rule on a spreadsheet and then remove them from a country. If you are a conservative and believe that people develop roots and become part of a culture, that would be an inhuman thing to do. And therefore it's frightening to people. How do you respond to that?
I think what is inhuman is consider that man is replaceable.
But would it be inhuman to take a 20-year-old British Asian, the person we talked about at the start of this conversation, someone with a British passport, someone whose first language is English, whose parents are first-generation arrivals from India or Bangladesh or Pakistan, let's say, and who is about to go to university in the country they love and they have belonged to for their entire life, and be told by your political movement that they are no longer welcome here and that we don't consider them, because of their parents and because of their skin color, we don't consider them English or British, and therefore we plan to remigrate them. Do you think that would be inhuman?
No, I think that would be very human. For one thing, I have no political movement, unfortunately, so I can't provoke any of those things. For I do think that would be very desirable, but if you are coherent with yourself, you think that French people in Algeria should have stayed in Algeria, and you are defending colonization.
Well, as I've said, I don't accept that it is colonization. The people you describe are not running the country.
An Indian was prime minister in Britain, and the mayor of your capital is from
Rishi Sunak was a British Indian who went to Winchester College, spoke beautiful English, and has lived here his whole life, and was a very English person, very British person. What was so remarkable when Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister is that it wasn't even discussed. People weren't even very interested in the colour of his skin. They were very upset by a lot of his policies and his failure to do all sorts of things. But the colour of his skin was not even controversial. So I struggle to see that there is this mass crime that you refer to, when he's a very good example of how little this is even a problem.
Well, you can say then that Queen Victoria was Indian. She was Empress of India. How more Indian can you be than that, being the head of the state?
She never even went to India. But I think we might get lost in
the press of the country.
We might get lost in history. Renaud Camus, thank you for your time today. We at UnHerd think that it's better to discuss things with people rather than ban them from the country. So on that, we do take a clear view, but evidently I don't see the world quite the way you do. But thank you for engaging with us.
Thank you.
That was Renaud Camus, the French writer who was banned this week from entering the United Kingdom. I will confess, a personal note, that I did not agree with him at all. I found his reading of history somewhat sketchy and slanted. I found the endless use of colonization as a term to describe immigration obviously a bit of an intellectual trick that gives him cover and that means that opposing him seems like being pro-colonization, which I did not buy as a tool of argument. I thought the practical plan of trying to identify by the million people who are insufficiently white or insufficiently English or French and find a process to eject them from the country is genuinely frightening, and I don't blame people for being really scandalized by that idea. The idea that it would be peaceful or is even possible is for the birds. But despite all of that, I guess I think he should be allowed to express his views. People should be allowed to challenge them. And probably by the end of it, you get a sense of his weaknesses as well as any strengths. So that's why we decided to talk to him today. Make up your own mind as ever and let us know in the comments. This was UnHerd.